right. So good morning again, everybody. Welcome to the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Wildlife Series, Episode 6, The Faking Dead, referring, of course, to the Virginia opossum. We're going to take a close look into the natural history of this incredible species that shares the same neighborhoods that we do. I do want to just point out something that I just heard this morning, and we were just starting to talk about this. The recent events have brought a lot to light, and so one of the birders from New York, this was shared with me from Robin. They're going to start a Black Birders Week starting May 31st, which is tomorrow or the next day. So I'm going to support Black Birders Week to the extent that I can, and the Urban Ecology Center can, and I encourage you to also. So I also just want to remind you of the Urban Ecology Center's In My Backyard website. It's full of videos, activities, and other fun and educational resources that help people of all ages explore nature in their own personal urban ecology centers, also known as your backyards. And if you don't have a backyard, you can focus on a patio garden or a neighborhood green space. I just watched Jeff Bagelin's Botany Walk and learned some cool things about the apple serviceberry, a very cool shrub in the rose family. And I do want to let everyone know that while our eco-travel program has been put on hiatus, we do have some great trips in the works for this fall and beyond. We are, of course, at the mercy of the state of the world, and safety is the main concern, safety of participants and safety of our global community. But we do hope to jump in as soon as we safely can. It will require some changes in how we travel, but as a teaser, we do have a trip planned to Wolf Ridge Nature Center in Minnesota during hawk migration. We have a couple trips to Costa Rica next year, one for families and one for adults involving some tropical field research. We're booked again on a 5-day journey through Penobscot Bay, Maine, on the schooner Louis R. French, the oldest commercial sailing vessel in the country, built in 1871, and a return to the magical country of Iceland next summer. Iceland actually just recently announced that they're opening back up for tourism this summer. So we know some or all of these might need to be postponed, but it helps me psychologically to keep them scheduled. Okay. So let's start talking about the Virginia opossum. I guess if you were to look at the first 5 critters in our series, the house sparrow, the American robin, northern cardinal, the gray squirrel, and the very frightening eastern cottontail rabbit, you probably thought, yeah, I've got those in my yard. I see rabbits and squirrels all the time. I've got robins eating worms on my lawn, house sparrows taking dust baths in my driveway, and cardinals eating seeds from my bird feeder. But if you're like me, you may have paused a bit when seeing the Virginia opossum. Like, wait, do I have possums in my backyard, in my neighborhood? I think so. I see them sometimes. You know, sometimes they're hit by cars, sometimes, but I usually don't see them very often. And I can confidently tell you they're there. Trust me, they're common, but we hardly ever see them, mainly because they are nocturnal, meaning they become active at night after the sun goes down and while most of us are sleeping. I'm going to do a little bit of a different approach today. I'm going to pause for just a minute, and I'd like you all to think about 3 things. You can write them down if you want, or type them in the comments section if you want, or but at the end of the episode, if we have time, we'll look back at these. So first, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you think of a possum? Second, what is one thing you know or think you know about possums? And finally, what is one thing you don't know about possums? So again, you can write it down, put it in the comments section, or just remember in your head, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you hear the word possum? What's the one thing you know or think you know about possums? And what's one thing you don't know about possums, but maybe would like to know? It's okay if you don't have an answer to any of these questions. We don't want this to be too much like school. But I'll just take a nice long draft of my hot coffee and give you just a few more seconds to think about this. And then I'll tell you a story that happened to me about 5 years ago. Okay. I was at my father-in-law's house during Thanksgiving, and my dog Banjo, which is pictured here with my son Henry, really needed to pee. But of course, I had just stuffed myself full of totally yummy food, and I wasn't sure if I could walk him all the way around the block unless someone had rolled me. So I opened the back door and I let Banjo in the backyard. And as soon as I did that, he took off for the neighbor's house. Now, this is a dog that does not like to be away from us. He sticks around. He does not run away. But he took off for the neighbor's house. He's barking like crazy. And by the time I caught up with him, his face was buried in something. I grabbed hold of him and I revealed a sight that pretty much looked exactly like this. So I brought Banjo back inside and I told my wife, hey, Banjo just killed a possum on Thanksgiving. And she said, well, how do you know? And I said, because the possum is dead. And then my wife, who is not a naturalist, said, you do realize possums play dead, don't you? And then it hit me like, oh yeah. So I walked back outside just in time to see the dead possum trotting away back to the alley as if nothing had happened, and I was feeling totally chagrined. But I was also reflecting on just how cool it was that I had witnessed a masterful adaptation of a very successful animal in action known as playing possum. So that was my first up-close encounter with this species, and that kind of began my fascination. So I like to start off each episode by introducing you to the animal, and then also by looking at where this animal belongs relative to its phylogeny, and by that I mean where it belongs in the great tree of life, which is based on the evolutionary history of all the organisms that have ever lived. A fun way to think about the phylogenetic tree is to first start with another familiar tree, a family tree. And I love this family tree in particular because it also allows us for a quick Spanish lesson. But if this family tree is from the point of view of this person, it's essentially a visual representation of their family. You can see who their siblings are, who their parents are, who their grandparents are, uncles, aunts, etc. And each row of people represents a generation. Okay, now this is important. The closer you are to another person in this family tree, the closer that relative is to you. And I don't mean closer like how comfortable you feel around them or how much you like them or how good their cookies are. I mean like closer in terms of how many genes you share with that person. So here's a fun activity you can try next time you're talking to a family member. Pretend this is your family tree. Anyone in this tree that is directly connected to you by one of these red lines shares, on average, half or 50% of your genes. This includes your parents, your children, and your siblings share 50% of your genes on average. If you're related through marriage, of course, this doesn't apply, and it also doesn't apply to identical twins. But if you have to go through a person, if you have to go through a person to get to another person along these red lines, for example, your mother's brother or your father's mother, then you share on average a quarter, or 25% of the genes with that person. So you share 25% of the genes with your grandparents, your grandchildren, your aunts, and your uncles. Now, if you have to go through two people to get to a person, let's say your mother's sister's daughter, also known as your first cousin, you share on average an eighth of the same genes, or 12.5%. So the more people you have to go through to get to a person means you share fewer and fewer genes on average, and so you become less related from a genetic perspective. But anytime you move up a generation or sideways between siblings, you cut the number of shared genes by half. So next time you see your first cousin or your great uncle, you can say, hey, did you know that we share 12.5% of the same genes on average? Pretty cool. I think so too. So it's not a direct comparison, but now let's go to an example of a phylogenetic tree. This shows the relationships of, in this case, dogs. So now instead of up and down, we're looking sideways. And each picture on the right represents a species instead of an individual. So like the family tree, species that are closer to each other on a phylogenetic tree are more closely related. So the domestic dog is most closely related to the gray wolf and a little less related to the coyote. It's even less related to the dhole, but more closely related to the dhole than it is to the jackal. Another major difference is that each row where lines split, now this doesn't represent generations, but it represents common evolutionary ancestors. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in later episodes. But this is just kind of a good way to think about how the tree of life works. And our great tree of life is based on a system that was started almost 300 years ago and one that we still use today. And so we can trace the path of the Virginia possum and any other organism through the tree of life, starting at the trunk. Now, you may have to take a little leap of faith with me here, but know that the bottom of the trunk represents the first life form ever on Earth, which gave rise to all the other life forms, essentially everything alive today. And all the leaves represent all of the species alive today, which is like way less than 1% of all the species that have ever existed. 99% of our leaves, like the dinosaurs, have long since fallen off the tree and been raked up. So as we move up the trunk from the first life form 3.5 billion years ago, you're kind of going forward in time. And at some point, the trunk hits its first major fork, and you have 7 very large branches coming out of it. And those are the largest groupings of organisms. The kingdoms. So depending on who you talk to, there are about 6 or 7 kingdoms. The animals and plants are the ones we're most familiar with. And of course, the possum falls squarely in the animal kingdom. The possum is an animal. With few exceptions, animals are organisms that eat, breathe oxygen, and move around like you and me. Then that big animal branch, possum's an animal, out of the trunk is divided further into phyla. And there are about a dozen phyla in the animal kingdom. And our possum is found along the branch representing chordates, which are for the most part animals with backbones. And you can feel your own backbone if you run your finger down along the base of your neck and feel all those bumps. That's your backbone. So now we're moving farther out on the branches of the tree, and the possum is an animal with a backbone, and now it's divided into classes. Within the chordates, there are 5 major classes you're very familiar with: mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibian, and fish. I like this illustration because it also shows the extinct classes. And of course, if you look on the far right, it's just a reminder of how closely related birds and dinosaurs truly are. But here on the far left, we will put our possum in the mammal class. Possums are mammals. That's something I had to think about for a minute too. They drink milk from mammary glands of their mothers. They nurse, essentially. They have hair or fur, just like us. In fact, we all share this strange fact that we have 3 bones in our inner ear. So now we move from the trunk. We're about halfway between the trunk and the leaves in our tree of life. And the mammal branch breaks down into about 25 different orders. Now it gets a little tricky because possums are marsupials. Marsupials are mammals, but the marsupial grouping is something called an infraclass, which is between class and order, so don't worry about this. But marsupials, as you may know, give birth to young called joeys. They're all called joeys, not just kangaroos. Possum young are also called joeys. And at a very early age, the tiny, tiny, barely developed babies move out of the womb into an external pouch and essentially attach onto a nipple, and they continue to nurse in the pouch, which is like a second womb. That's going to be important later, like a kangaroo. So they're born out of the original womb and they move into the pouch, and they're completely helpless, and they continue to develop there. Some unfortunately don't actually make that journey, but most do. The possums actually belong to, and you'll have to bear with me, I'm going to give you some long words, the order Didelphimorphia, which is the New World possums, New World meaning North and South America. And if you were wondering who the closest relatives of primates are, it's the colugos. of Southeast Asia. These are the closest relatives to primates. So I had to look this one up, and I'm glad I did, because I mean, look at this thing. It's actually a gliding lemur. There are only 2 species left in the whole world. Both are in Southeast Asia. And this, I mean, it's hard to believe, but this is our, as in primates, this is our closest living relative. So if you ever need a pick-me-up, just start Googling Colugo. You won't be disappointed falling into a Colugo hole on the internet and thinking, man, I'm related to these things. They're just so cool. Okay, moving on. And we're getting closer to the edge of the tree. The next group of after order is family. There's only one living family in the order Didelphimorphia, which is the family Didelphidae. All the other branches broke off and became extinct. But within the Didelphidae family, there's 17 genera, and the possum is in the genus Didelphis. If your eyes have been glazing over with all these long words, I'll just give you one kind of cool fact. Didelphis, so all these words, Didelphidae, Didelphimorphia, Didelphis, that prefix Didelph is derived from Greek, and it means 2 wombs. So referring to the actual womb and then the pouch, which serves as a second womb. So that's where the name comes from. Okay, so now we're at the tiniest twig at the end of the tree, and this tiny branch that we're on only has 6 leaves. There's only 6 species in this genus, and one of them is our Virginia opossum. So we made it all the way to the edge of the tree from the common ancestor of all life, and we basically took the long way to say that the Virginia opossum is an animal with a backbone of the marsupial mammal variety belonging to the New World possums. Now it's time to talk about all the cool stuff going on in the possum world and answer all of the questions that I came up with about the possum. So first of all, the word opossum comes from an Algonquian word meaning white animal. Colloquially, the Virginia opossum is also known as a North American opossum, or most commonly just possum, at least in these parts. If you go to Australia, there's an entirely different group of animals called possums that aren't related to our possums. They're an entirely different branch of the tree. If you've yet to see one in the wild, they are about the same size as a pet cat. And in 1608, explorer John Smith wrote the first written description that we have. There were a lot of descriptions before then, but this is the first written description. The possum describing it as follows, quote, "An opossum hath an head like a swine, and a tail like a rat, and is of the bigness of a cat. Under her belly she hath a bag, wherein she lodgeth, carrieth, and sucketh her young." Sucketh is a word. Okay. Here is a look at the range of the possum on a map, mainly east of the Rockies from New England down into Central America. But what's really interesting is when you look at the original range versus the expanded range. When Europeans arrived in North America, the possum barely made it into Wisconsin, just poked into eastern Texas. But like a lot of our backyard critters that we've talked about, opossum do really well in urban habitats. And as more and more people settled and populations grew, the range of the possum expanded northward, almost up to Lake Superior, up to New England, and south all the way to Costa Rica, and westward, they're knocking on the door of Arizona. They were introduced to the West Coast as a source of food during the Great Depression. I don't really talk about possums as food, but there is a whole culture, I think even with the joy of cooking, on cooking possum. But during the Great Depression, they were introduced to the West Coast as a source of food, and they continue to thrive there as well today. So this expansion will likely continue, but the main thing that's holding back at least the northward expansion is that they can handle cold winters, but they just don't do really well in frigid winters. So their journey northward may be held back temporarily, but as the planet continues to warm, who knows how far north they're going to go. Let's just say possums are doing very well. But the real question is this. The Virginia opossum is the only marsupial in the entire United States and Canada. But why is there only one species of marsupial here, but there's over 100 species in South America, and we're all connected? This is one of my favorite stories to tell, and this one starts about 65 million years ago when our continents were in different places than they are This is right about the time dinosaurs are going extinct and mammals are beginning their ascent. And incidentally, this is also the time when we think the opossum evolved. It's been around a long time. So possums shared the earth with dinosaurs. At the same time, South America, Antarctica, and Australia, you can kind of see them at the bottom, were connected. And that little supercontinent was dominated by marsupials. But eventually these continents separated. So what happened to the marsupials on each of those three continents? Well, the Australian marsupials persist today. They're doing very well. The marsupials on Antarctica had a much worse fate, essentially freezing to extinction. But believe it or not, there are a lot of marsupial fossils that we find there. So we know they were there at one point. And then the marsupials in South America persist today, but they took kind of a hit compared to their Australian cousins. About 3 million years ago, after being separated for about 60 million years, North and South America reunited. They're reconnected by a land bridge at the Isthmus of Panama, and this resulted in what's called the Great American Faunal Interchange. Placental mammals had been evolving and dominated in North America. Marsupial mammals had been evolving and dominated in South America. And when the two continents connected, the placental mammals poured into South America and the marsupials poured into Mexico and North America. So if the UEC were offering eco-travel to Costa Rica 3 million years ago, this is what it would have looked like. So instead of having lunch like I did with some of you underneath a boa constrictor, we would have been hanging out with elephants and giant sloths and 15-foot tall bear terror birds that were roaming the Americas, excuse me. But it turns out that placental mammals had a much bigger evolutionary advantage. And so when the two animals had similar niches, the placental mammal almost always outcompeted and displaced the marsupial version of it. For example, the placental smilodon from North America caused the extinction of the marsupial Thylacosmilus from South America. So it's crazy to think that there was a placental version and a marsupial version of the saber-toothed tiger, both filling their respective niches. But as like a lot of what happened, mostly the placental mammal kind of won out in the end. And then of course, the smilodon went extinct about 10,000 years ago. But because of this advantage, many more placental mammals spread south. So these are all South American mammals that originated in North America, as are these. But there was only one marsupial tough enough to survive this placental onslaught and actually invade north of the Mexico-US border and continue to invade today. And that is our own Virginia opossum, the only one to make its way north. Probably because they're so secretive and nocturnal, we kind of have to rely on media portrayals of possums. And I'm curious to hear what your thoughts were with possums. But if we're looking at the normal media, we probably learned that possums are not too smart. They're dirty, disease-ridden, kind of tree rats that hang from their tails with their babies. And the one cool trick that they have going for them is that they can play dead. I don't know if that's, how your experiences have been, but my goal is to peel back some of these layers with a little fact-checking of stereotypes. Like we already know, for example, they are not related to rats. They're pretty distantly related as far as mammals go. And as my opening story illustrated, possums do in fact play dead. But what I didn't realize is the degree to which they pull this off. It's incredible. So if I were gonna play dead, I would like fall on my side and stop moving, right? I mean, that's what I would do. I don't know what you would do if you're playing dead. But possums don't just do this. They like straight up seize up, flop over, tongue out, eyes open and staring blankly ahead, unblinking, and they can hold this pose for an hour or more. And And while it's in this comatose state, its heart rate actually slows by half, and its breathing slows by a third. But it gets better. While they're pretending to be a corpse, they also emit a putrid fluid and odor out of their butt, essentially a glorified fart that smells like death to a fox or to my dog Banjo. So this may seem like a lot of drama to go through as a defense mechanism, but it works. And at the end of the day, it's better that the possum goes home instead of spending the day inside of a bobcat's belly. But it doesn't stop here. There's one more final layer to this crazy behavior. This whole thing is completely involuntary. So possums will fight, and they'll fight hard, but at some point they have no control over when or for how long they remain in this comatose state. It's all involuntary. It's a reaction that's triggered by the stress of an attack caused at some level. And while in that state, talk about zombies, they're fully conscious, their brain activity is normal, but it's involuntary. So if you're wondering if possums really do play dead, the answer is a resounding yes, and then some. Okay, now what about this perception that possums are dirty and smelly? If we can kind of ignore that putrid smell that I just talked about that they release when they're attacked, possums actually don't smell that bad. And I don't know if this was like lab testers smelling different animals, but they actually hardly smell like anything at all, in part because they lack sweat glands. And they groom themselves very frequently with their tongue and their paws. So as far as animals go, they're actually quite clean and not smelly, if that's the term. So let's throw away that perception that they're dirty and smelly. What about spreading diseases? That might be one of your questions, like rabies. Actually, it turns out that rabies is extremely uncommon in possums, in part because some of you know that birds keep a very high body temperature, about 104, to help fight viruses. But the possum's body temperature is around 94 degrees, which is actually too cold for a lot of viruses, and particularly the rabies virus. It can't replicate successfully when it's that cold. So it's extremely unlikely to find a rabid opossum. And not only do they not spread diseases like rabies, they actually perform a very valuable public health service because they eat a lot of ticks. When they're rummaging through the grass, rummaging through your garbage, rummaging through the vegetation, they pick up a lot of ticks and they eat them. A single possum can consume in a season about 5,000 disease-spreading ticks. And there's evidence that the more possums there are in an area, there's a lower incidence of tick-borne diseases like Lyme's disease. So not only do they not spread diseases, or most of the diseases, they actually help prevent disease in your community. And check this out. Here's a trail cam footage of a possum actually picking ticks off of a deer at a feeding station. This is just a crazy symbiotic relationship in which both animals benefit, and both animals sought out this relationship. So what about their intelligence? Where do they fall in this animal IQ spectrum? Turns out that in laboratory tests, they show better spatial memory than rats, cats, pigs, and dogs when food is a reward. That's hard for me to believe, or maybe anybody with a dog, because food is the reward for everything, for Banjo. But possums actually show better spatial memory with food as a reward than dogs, and they're also good at remembering when something is toxic or noxious. So I don't know. They're not dirty, not full of diseases. They help prevent diseases. They're not smelly. They're fairly smart. The more we understand about this critter, the more I come to appreciate it. I have a lot more stories to tell, but I don't have a lot of time to tell them. So I'm going to kind of move into fast fact frenzy mode. Okay, ready? Here we go. Fact: possums are immune to almost all snake venom from areas where they coexist, And scientists are hoping to harvest the antivenom properties from possums to eventually help humans. And they just recently started successful clinical trials in mice. Fact, possums do have prehensile tails. In fact, a lot of South American animals, mammals, and other animals have prehensile tails. But they use that tail to carry grass, they use it to carry other objects, they use it to help build nests, and it acts as a fifth limb when climbing for stability, like with monkeys. And some snakes actually have prehensile tails. You probably think all snakes have prehensile tails, but some don't and some do. But anyway, prehensile tail means that they can control that tail, wrap it around a branch. It acts kind of having like another leg or arm. They can hang from their tail, but unlike the cartoon portrayals, they don't actually sleep while hanging from their tails, because this is pretty hard for them. It may be easier for this young possum, but it's a lot of stress on their tail to actually hang from it. So they don't like to do it. They only do it for a little while. So they can only hang on for a short while from their tail. Fact, in addition to feasting on human garbage, possums have an opposable clawless thumb in the back, which helps it climb trees, helps it grasp and carry objects. And if you take a close look at the back foot in this photo, you can see it. And you can also see it in their footprints. Fact, possums have more teeth than any other North American land animal, with 50. And they have 10 upper incisors, and no other mammal here has more than 6 upper incisors. So they have 4 more upper incisors than any other animal. A lot of teeth. Fact, opossums have 13 nipples arranged in a circle with one in the middle. So here is a bunch of very young possum joeys nursing in that didelph, or that second womb, also known as the marsupial pouch. Fact, opossums show extreme variation in size. An adult male from the northern part of its range can be 20 times heavier than an adult female from the tropics. And boy, there's just a lot to say about possums. But I think the best way to kind of end this talk is with pictures. We already know that young joeys finish developing inside the pouch, but then at some point they have to leave. And what happens next? Mama carries them around like a walking apartment complex. Now, I'm sure this has a huge adaptive benefit, but let's be honest, the real upside of this behavior is that humans get to take pictures. So, I do recognize that I probably painted a fairly rosy picture of the possum, in part, I'm sure, to counteract the negative stereotypes that are normally shared. They are wild creatures and should be treated as such. They will fight, as I mentioned. They do carry some parasites, but as wild creatures in our neighborhood, if left alone, they will quietly go about their business, performing the public services we now know or know that they provide. And if there's ever a night when you're lying in bed and you can't sleep, maybe think about that possum that is very likely outside your bedroom window, being a good mom. And at the end of the day, at the very least, this is a survivor. It's been around for 70 million years and it hung out with dinosaurs. Just think about that.
We have a question, Tim.
Yep.
Do they hibernate in winter?
They don't hibernate as like a full extent hibernate, but they will, curl up and hunker down, as far as I know. And that was actually my last slide, so I can kind of wrap up, and then we can have a chance to chat too. But I do just want to thank everybody for joining me. I'll be here every Friday at this time until somebody tells me to stop. So thanks for supporting the UEC by tuning in. We are very happy to bring you free virtual programming while the centers are closed. If there are other ways that I or anybody at the Urban Ecology Center can support you during this time, please let me know. And if you are financially able to support the center through this time, it's also much appreciated. Just tell them you enjoyed hearing about urban wildlife. But also know that you are helping me and the rest of the staff just by staying in touch with us. We we miss you, and we're very much looking forward to seeing you in person again someday soon. And if you're not in Wisconsin, we'd love for you to come visit us when you can.